Henry Thompson's voice was ice-cold as he delivered the ultimatum that would shatter his son's carefree world. "This ends now, Richard," he said, leaning forward across the imposing mahogany desk. "No more reckless spending. No more parties. No more entitlement." Richard, slouched in the leather chair, rolled his eyes. "What are you going to do, Dad? Ground me?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But Henry's lips curved into a sharp, humorless smile. "Not this time. You've crossed the line, and I'm going to fix you." "Fix me?" Richard shot back, his posture stiffening. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You're getting married." The words hit like a thunderclap. Richard blinked, his mind reeling. "Married? You've lost your mind. There's no way." "You don't have a choice," Henry cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "Her name is Emma. She's a farmer, living in Vermont. Hardworking, resilient, everything you're not. You'll marry her, live on that farm, and finally learn what it means to earn something." Richard's mouth fell open. "You've got to be kidding me. A farmer? I don't even know this woman." "That's the point," Henry said, standing to his full height, towering over his son. "You leave in 2 days. Either take this opportunity to prove you can be more than a spoiled failure, or walk away from the family fortune forever." For the first time, Richard's smirk faltered. He stared at his father, searching for any sign of a bluff. There was none. The next 2 days passed in a blur of disbelief and growing dread. When Richard arrived at the farm, suitcase in hand, he found himself standing before a weathered farmhouse that seemed like it belonged in a different century. And there, on the porch, was Emma. She wasn't what he expected. Dressed in worn jeans and a plaid shirt, her sharp eyes assessed him with an intensity that made him feel more out of place than ever. "So, you're the one I'm supposed to marry," Emma said, her tone flat. Richard squared his shoulders. "And you must be thrilled about this arrangement," he shot back. Emma didn't flinch. "Not even a little. Let's get this over with." Henry Thompson was not a man to be questioned. Decades of building an empire had honed his ability to manipulate and control, and he now turned that power against his own son. Richard had always been a disappointment, squandering money on parties, women, and frivolous pursuits. "This isn't about punishment, Richard," Henry said, his voice like steel. "This is about survival. You think the world owes you something because of your last name. It doesn't." "Spare me the lecture," Richard snapped, but his voice betrayed his unease. "You'll marry Emma," Henry continued, unperturbed, "and live with her on that farm until I say otherwise. You'll work hard, earn your keep, and maybe, just maybe, you'll become someone I can trust with the family legacy." Richard's fists clenched at his sides. "And if I refuse, then you're on your own," Henry said simply. "No money, no safety net. You wouldn't last a month." Richard's stomach churned. He could hear the finality in his father's tone, the unwavering resolve. He knew Henry wasn't bluffing. 2 days later, Richard stood on the edge of a dusty gravel road, staring at the farmhouse in the distance. Every step toward it felt like a nail in the coffin of his old life. He was still fuming when he reached the porch and found Emma waiting. Her expression was unreadable as she looked him up and down. "I guess your father didn't tell you much about me," she said. Richard raised an eyebrow. "What's there to tell? You're a farmer. Congratulations." Emma's eyes narrowed. "I didn't want this any more than you did, but this is my home, my livelihood. Don't expect me to make it easy for you," Richard scoffed, dropping his suitcase with a thud. "Trust me, I don't want to be here any more than you want me here." "Good," Emma said, turning back toward the house. "Then we understand each other. Let's get started." Richard hesitated, standing on the porch as Emma disappeared inside. He felt the weight of his father's expectations pressing down on him, the suffocating reality of the life he had been thrust into. This was going to be hell. And yet, as he followed Emma into the farmhouse, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than either of them. The morning came too early for Richard. The sound of a rooster crowing felt like an alarm clock from hell, jarring him from restless sleep in the creaky, too-small bed. He groaned, burying his face in the pillow, but a sharp knock on the door shattered his fleeting hopes of more rest. "Get up," Emma's voice called, firm and unrelenting. "We start early here." Richard staggered to the door, barely dressed, his hair a disheveled mess. "Do you know what time it is? People are still asleep in civilized parts of the world." Emma stood in the hallway, arms crossed and eyebrows raised. "Welcome to farm life. Civilized or not, work doesn't wait for you." She thrust a pair of work gloves at him. "Put these on. You'll need them." Outside, the fresh morning air was a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. The fields stretched endlessly, the horizon painted with hues of gold and green. But Richard couldn't appreciate any of it as Emma led him toward the barn. "You'll start here," Emma said, gesturing toward a row of stalls. "Muck them out. Feed the horses. Simple enough." Richard froze, staring at the mess. "Muck them out? What does that even mean?" Emma sighed, her patience already wearing thin. "It means cleaning the stalls. Shovel out the manure, replace the straw, and make sure the horses are comfortable." "This is insane," Richard muttered, wrinkling his nose. "I'm not some manual laborer." "No," Emma shot back, her tone sharper now. "You're a spoiled city boy who's about to learn the value of hard work. Unless you'd rather call Daddy and quit?" Her words stung more than he wanted to admit. Grumbling under his breath, Richard grabbed the shovel and got to work. Hours later, drenched in sweat and smelling like he'd rolled in the muck himself, Richard slumped against the barn wall, utterly defeated. Emma walked in, carrying a bucket of water, and raised an eyebrow at the state of him. "Not bad for your first day," she said. "Not bad." Richard glared at her. "This is torture." Emma shrugged. "Welcome to my world." The days dragged on, each one blending into the next as Richard stumbled through his new reality. Emma gave him no breaks, her demands constant and her tone unyielding. But something began to shift as he grew more familiar with the work. The exhaustion that once felt unbearable started to feel strangely satisfying. That shift, however, was tested when a sudden storm swept through the farm one afternoon. The dark clouds rolled in quickly, bringing with them a fierce wind that howled through the trees. Richard had been hauling hay when Emma came running toward him. "Drop everything!" she shouted over the rising wind. "We need to get the animals inside now!" Panic gripped him as the first raindrops fell, large and heavy. He followed Emma toward the barn, their boots sinking into the quickly softening ground. "Get the horses in first," Emma commanded, her voice sharp as lightning streaked across the sky. Richard's hands fumbled with the reins, his heart pounding as the horses neighed nervously. "They're not cooperating." "They're scared," Emma said, pushing past him to calm the nearest horse. "Move slowly. Stay steady." Despite the chaos, her voice was a strange anchor, keeping him focused as they worked together to secure the animals. The storm raged on, thunder cracking overhead, but they didn't stop until every stall was filled, every gate locked tight. Emma turned to him, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. "We need to check the fences. If the wind takes any of them down, the animals could get loose." "Are you serious?" Richard asked, his voice shaking. "Dead serious," Emma replied. "Come on." The wind whipped around them as they reached the far edge of the field. Several sections of the fence had already fallen, the wood splintered and broken. "Grab the hammer and nails!" Emma shouted, barely audible over the roaring wind. Richard hesitated, the storm pressing down on him like a weight, but Emma's determined expression spurred him into action. Together they worked frantically to secure the fence, their hands numb and trembling from the cold rain. When the last nail was hammered in, they both collapsed to the muddy ground, gasping for breath. "That was insane," Richard said, his voice raw. Emma gave a small, weary smile. "Welcome to farm life." For a moment they sat there, the storm still howling around them but feeling strangely distant. Richard glanced at Emma, seeing her in a new light. She wasn't just tough. She was relentless, unyielding in the face of adversity. As they made their way back to the house, drenched and exhausted, Richard found himself filled with a grudging respect for her. Inside, the warmth of the house was a welcome relief. Emma handed him a towel, her expression softening for the first time since he'd arrived. "You did good out there," she said quietly. Richard blinked, surprised. Thanks." She nodded, turning to leave. But before she could go, he spoke again. "Emma," he said, his voice hesitant. "I don't think I've ever worked that hard in my life. I don't think I've ever needed to." Emma stopped in the doorway, glancing back at him. Maybe that's the problem. Her words lingered in the air long after she was gone, echoing in his mind as he sat by the fire, drying off. For the first time, he began to wonder if Henry had been right all along, if this life, as grueling as it was, might be exactly what he needed to find himself. The storm had left its mark on the farm, but in the days that followed, Richard found himself settling into a rhythm he hadn't expected. Each morning began with the crow of the rooster and Emma's no-nonsense knock on his door. By the time the sun rose, he was out in the fields, mucking stalls, feeding animals or mending fences. At first it was exhausting, but soon something shifted. The physical labor started to feel oddly rewarding, the blisters on his hands a strange badge of honor. "You're improving," Emma said one morning as she watched him guide one of the horses back to the barn. "Don't sound too impressed," Richard shot back, though there was a faint grin on his face. Emma smirked. "Just don't get cocky. You still haven't mastered the tractor." The two had found a tentative truce. Their conversations were still laced with sarcasm, but there was a growing sense of respect beneath it all. Richard no longer looked at Emma as just a farmer. She was sharp, resilient, and carried herself with a strength he couldn't ignore. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Richard collapsed onto the porch steps, staring out at the horizon as the sun dipped below the fields. Emma joined him, setting down 2 glasses of water. "You didn't quit today," she said, taking a sip. "Didn't have a choice," Richard replied, his tone lighter than it had been in weeks. "You always have a choice," Emma said, her voice quieter now. "The fact that you're still here says something." Richard glanced at her, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. "Maybe I'm finally figuring out what I'm made of." Emma didn't reply immediately, but the faint smile on her lips said enough. The knock on the farmhouse door came just as Richard was finishing the morning chores. Emma was out back, tending to the chickens, so he wiped his hands on his jeans and opened the door. Standing there, sharp as ever in an immaculate suit, was Henry Thompson. "Dad?" Richard blinked, caught off guard by his father's sudden appearance. Henry's eyes swept over the modest farmhouse, his expression unreadable. "So, this is where you've been hiding?" Richard stiffened. "I wouldn't call it hiding. What are you doing here?" Henry stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his polished shoes looking absurdly out of place on the worn wooden floors. "I came to see what's become of my son, and to give you an offer." Richard's jaw tightened. He should have known this was coming. "What kind of offer?" "Come back to New York," Henry said, his tone as smooth as ever. "I'll reinstate your position in the company, set you up with everything you left behind. All you have to do is walk away from this experiment." Richard's heart sank. He had been waiting for this moment, imagining the freedom of returning to his old life. But now, standing in the farmhouse that had somehow become home, he wasn't so sure. "And Emma?" Richard asked, his voice low. Henry's lips curled into a cold smile. "The arrangement was never meant to be permanent. She gets what she wanted, the farm saved, and you get your life back. It's a win-win." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. "So, that's it? Just leave her here like none of this ever happened?" Henry shrugged. She knew what she was getting into. This was a business deal, Richard. Nothing more. Before Richard could respond, Emma walked in, wiping her hands on a towel. She froze when she saw Henry, her eyes narrowing. "What's he doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp. Henry turned to her, his gaze cool. "Just ensuring my son doesn't throw his future away." Emma's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, letting Richard take the lead. "I need time to think," Richard said finally, his voice strained. Henry nodded, his expression smug. "Don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever." As Henry left, the tension in the room was palpable. Emma crossed her arms, her eyes locked on Richard. What was that about? Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He wants me to go back to New York. Leave the farm. Leave you." Emma's face betrayed no emotion, but her voice was steady. "And what do you want?" Richard looked at her, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted. "Figure it out," Emma said, turning back toward the kitchen. "Because if you're going to leave, do it sooner rather than later." Her words stung, but Richard couldn't blame her. She had fought so hard to save the farm, and now he was standing at a crossroads, unsure of where his loyalty lay. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Richard replayed his father's words and Emma's quiet strength in his mind. The decision wasn't just about leaving the farm, it was about who he wanted to be. The old Richard would have jumped at Henry's offer without a second thought. But now, the life he had once craved felt hollow compared to the tangible, honest work he had found here. By morning, Richard knew he had to make a choice. He had to decide whether to return to the gilded cage of his past, or to carve out a future that was messy, real, and entirely his own. The morning sunlight spilled through the farmhouse windows, but Richard couldn't feel its warmth. His father's words still echoed in his mind, each one like a chain pulling him back toward his old life. He spent the morning going through the motions of the farm chores, his thoughts heavy. By mid-afternoon he found Emma in the barn, her sleeves rolled up as she brushed one of the horses. Her movements were steady, but there was an air of tension in the way she worked. "Emma," Richard began, his voice tentative. She didn't stop, her focus on the horse. "Have you made your decision?" Richard hesitated. "I'm staying." The brush paused mid-stroke, and Emma turned to face him. "Are you sure? Because if you're not, don't say it just to make me feel better." "I'm sure," Richard said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing something real here. Something that matters." Emma studied him, her sharp eyes searching for any sign of doubt. "And your father?" "He's not going to make it easy," Richard admitted. "He already threatened to cut me off completely." "Then why stay?" Emma asked, her voice softer now. "You have every reason to go back." Richard took a step closer, his voice steady. "Because this life, this farm, this work, it's hard, but it's honest. And you've shown me what it means to fight for something worth keeping." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emma nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You'll need to tell him." That evening Henry called. The tension in the air was palpable as Richard picked up the phone. "Well?" Henry's voice was cold, impatient. "Have you come to your senses?" "I've made my decision," Richard said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm staying." The silence on the other end was deafening. When Henry finally spoke, his tone was sharp. "You're throwing away everything for a farm and a woman you barely know. You'll regret this, Richard." "Maybe," Richard replied, his grip tightening on the phone. "But it's my choice. For once, it's my life." Henry's laughter was bitter. "You're on your own now. Don't come crawling back when it all falls apart." The line went dead, and Richard stood there, the weight of his father's words heavy in the quiet kitchen. But instead of fear, he felt something else. Freedom. The days after Richard's decision were quieter but no less intense. The revelation of Henry's manipulation and Emma's initial deal still lingered between them like an unspoken weight. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Richard found Emma sitting on the porch, staring out at the horizon. He joined her, the old wooden steps creaking under his weight. "You've been avoiding me," he said, breaking the silence. Emma didn't look at him. "I figured you needed time to process everything." "I have," Richard said, "and I need to know the truth. Why didn't you tell me about the deal with my father?" Emma sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I didn't know how. When your father offered the arrangement, I was desperate. The farm was falling apart, and I didn't have any other options." She paused, her voice quieter now. "I didn't expect you to stay. I thought you'd hate it here, hate me, and leave as soon as you could." "I did hate it," Richard admitted. "At first. But things changed. I changed." He turned to her, his gaze steady. "You should have told me, Emma. I deserve to know." "You're right," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time. "I was afraid that if you knew the truth, it would push you away." "I'm still here," Richard said, his voice firm. "But we have to be honest with each other from now on. No more secrets." Emma nodded, her expression softening. No more secrets. The tension between them seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a fragile but growing trust. In the following days, Richard threw himself into the work with renewed determination. He wasn't just proving something to himself anymore, he was proving it to Emma too. He repaired fences, cared for the animals, and even managed to get the tractor running, a feat that earned him a rare smile from Emma. "You're getting better," she said one evening as they stood in the barn, watching the horses settle for the night. "Maybe you're rubbing off on me," Richard said with a grin. Emma chuckled, the sound light but genuine. "Don't get too comfortable. There's always more work to do." For the first time, Richard didn't mind. One night, as they sat by the fire after a long day, Richard turned to Emma. "What made you stay, even when things were falling apart?" Emma stared into the flames, her expression thoughtful. "This farm is more than just land to me. It's my family's legacy. My father worked every inch of this place with his own hands. When he passed, I promised myself I wouldn't let it go, no matter how hard it got." Richard nodded, understanding her words in a way he wouldn't have months ago. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met, Emma." Emma glanced at him, her lips curving into a small smile. "You're stronger than you think, Richard. You just needed to find it." As the fire crackled and the night deepened, a quiet sense of peace settled over them. They weren't just two people thrown together by circumstance anymore. They were partners, building something real together. The farm had never felt more alive. The once overwhelming tasks that had drained Richard now carried a sense of purpose. He and Emma worked together seamlessly, their movements synchronized like the gears of a well-oiled machine. Each morning, Richard found himself waking before the rooster crowed, ready to face the day with an eagerness that would have been unimaginable just months ago. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the fields in warm golden light, Richard stood by the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. He watched Emma as she finished tending to the horses, her silhouette framed against the fading glow. "You've done a lot for this place," Emma said as she approached him, her voice softer than usual. "So have you," Richard replied, his gaze steady. "But this isn't just your fight anymore. It's ours." Emma tilted her head, studying him. "You're different now, you know. When you first got here, I thought you'd last a week at most." Richard smirked. "To be fair, I thought the same thing. But this place, it changed me. You changed me." Emma's cheeks flushed slightly, and for once she didn't have a sharp reply. Instead, she smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that Richard had come to treasure. As they stood together, a sudden noise broke the stillness. A car approached the farmhouse, its sleek black exterior glaringly out of place against the rustic backdrop. Richard's chest tightened as the familiar figure of his father, Henry Thompson, stepped out. Henry wasted no time, his sharp gaze cutting across the yard as he approached. "Richard," he said, his tone clipped, "we need to talk." Richard stepped forward, his shoulders squared. "I've already made my decision, Dad. I'm staying." Henry's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the tension was thick enough to cut. "You're throwing everything away for this farm? For her?" He glanced at Emma with a sneer. "Careful," Richard warned, his voice firm. "Emma is the reason this farm is still standing, and it's more than just a farm. It's a life I've built with her. Something real." Henry's lips curled into a bitter smile. Real? You think mucking stalls and fixing fences is real? You were born for more than this. No, Richard said, his voice unwavering. I was born into a world where everything was handed to me. But I've finally learned what it means to work for something, to fight for something. And I'm not giving that up. Emma stepped beside Richard, her presence steady and unwavering. This farm isn't about status or money, she said, her voice calm but resolute. It's about heart. And I think Richard's found his. Henry stared at them both, his jaw tightening. For a moment Richard thought he might argue, might unleash one final tirade. But then, with a shake of his head, Henry turned and walked back to his car. Good luck, he said over his shoulder, his tone cold. You'll need it. The sound of the car's engine faded into the distance, leaving Richard and Emma standing in the quiet of the evening. You okay? Emma asked, her voice gentle. Richard exhaled deeply. Yeah. For the first time in a long time, I am. In the weeks that followed, the farm continued to flourish. With each passing day, Richard felt more at home, not just on the farm, but in his own skin. The work was still hard, but it was no longer a punishment. It was a choice. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Richard turned to Emma. You know, he said, I never thought I'd find happiness here. But now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Emma smiled, her hand resting lightly on his. You've earned it, Richard. You've earned this life. The stars above seemed to twinkle in agreement, and for the first time, Richard felt a deep sense of peace. The farm wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of everything he and Emma had overcome together. What about you? If you were in Richard's shoes, would you choose the life of luxury or the hard-earned satisfaction of a simpler, more meaningful existence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling tales. Your feedback is invaluable to us. Rate this story, share your favorite moments, and tell us what you'd like to see next. Thank you for watching, and we hope this story brought a little inspiration to your day. Here's wishing you an incredible journey in your own life, filled with love, purpose, and the courage to choose what truly matters.